My presentation would be about the Maqāṣid Discourse from Islamic Modernism to Theorising Authoritarianism. And as we all know, that's the brief covering to the historical background of the Maqāṣid Discourse. Maqāṣid Sharia refers to the higher objectives of Sharia or the Islamic law, which are aimed to promote public benefit and preventing potential harm. Interestingly, the studies of Maqāṣid Sharia have been based on various phases of development. They are either traditional, which is roughly between the 11th and to the 15th century, or from the late 19th century onwards. For the traditional approach, it features scholars like Imam al-Juwayni, al-Qarafi, al-Ghazali, al-Shatibi, and it is mainly based on the 5 objectives of Sharia, namely religion, life, offspring, and intellect, and property or wealth. These scholars or this approach focus on the idea that the maqasid or the objectives of Sharia are extracted from the text through the process of induction and not deduction, and that it is connected actually to usul al-fiqh and does not constitute a source of law in its own. The second approach to Maqāṣid al-Sharia is the modern approach of Maqāṣid, which is started by the Ottoman jurist who, by the late of 19th century, who proposed for new objectives of Sharia or more objectives of Sharia that are to be compatible with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire in order to promote modernization, in order to stop the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. This conversation that started by the Ottoman jurists continued among the scholars and reformists in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Syria. The most significant feature of this approach, the modern approach to Maqāṣid or the Maqāṣid-oriented approach, is that it proposed that Maqāṣid should be independent of usul al-fiqh, as speakers before me have mentioned, and it's to be made into a new scientific discipline. Scholars of this also era or this approach proposed new objectives and priorities of Sharia, such as freedom of thought, equality, justice, human rights, social orders, all as objectives of Islamic law. Some of them have even, like Rashid Rida, suggested that Maqāṣid approach should be used without any traditional limitations related to usul al-fiqh. After this era, or if we speak about the contemporary scholar or the second generation of modernist reformers or Maqāṣid al-Sharia, these scholars also expand the scope of Maqāṣid, that it should be beyond, again, like the first generation of reformers, that it should be beyond the objectives of Sharia by highlighting the public benefit and well-being. They reject literal reading of sacred texts or spiritual resources. They expand the application of the objective to be reinterpreted the Islamic law in light of the modernist values to ensure that they remain compatible with the modern realities or modern context. They adopt notions like, especially after the Arab Spring, I would argue, scholars like Al-Qaradawi, Tariq Ramadan, Jasir Ouda, Ahmed al-Raisuni, Abdullah Bin Bayyah. Many of them have, some of them have introduced notions such as democracy, justice, human rights in the socio-political order. Maqāṣid Sharia, the second generation or the contemporary generation of Maqāṣid reformers, unlike the first generation, they actually promote or support or encourage positive relation between the Muslim world and the West. However, such encouragement or such promotion for the idea of positive relation with the West does not mean, it is believed that it does not mean that the Maqāṣid-oriented approach necessarily result in a compatible adoption of the Western values or Western policies. One of the interesting research that I came across is Halim Rain study that he conducted in 2010, where he interviewed interviewed political maqāṣidis or political actors who adopted maqāṣid approach as in their political policies in Turkey, Malaysia, and I think in Indonesia. And he concluded that the only issue that causes a lot of debate between the contemporary generation of Maqāṣidic reformers and the West was and still the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, it seems that with today's with Sheikh Abdullah Bin Bayyah's politicization and use of the Maqāṣid discourse, it seems that this is not the same anymore. Employing the Maqāṣid-oriented approach as a tool to bring about legal change was and still debatable. Technically, the debate is about the constant increase of the objectives and the priorities of the Islamic law from scholars to another. In which basis can these objectives be prioritized and reinterpreted when a conflict arises between them? To what extent may this reinterpretation and prioritization of maqāṣid affect the authority and the credibility of the theory? Can it make it, turn it into a tool in the hand of those with contradictory ideological, social, and political inclinations? And what is the most acceptable methodology to apply the maqāṣid-oriented approach without being subject to certain agendas or scholars' subjectivities? These questions were the motive behind this paper that aims to address how the Maqāṣid discourse has been politicized in light of the recent declarations and fatwa by Sheikh Abdullah Bin Bayyah concerning the UAE normalized relation with Israel and the UAE policies against regional democracies. My argument is that Sheikh Abdullah Bin Bayyah's prioritization of maqāṣid and reinterpretation of maslaha were deeply rooted in the maqāṣid discourse and the rational reasoning related to the contemporary Islamic modernism and not the traditional discourse. In brief, Abdullah Bin Bayyah, as Bika mentioned before me, he is a prominent Mauritanian Maqāṣidi who was born in 1935. He is a well-recognized politician as well as a jurist in both the Middle East and the West. He has worked with various Arab government and media, and his fatwas and declaration are considered authoritative. Bin Bayyah was previously deputy head of Union of Muslim Scholars, which was headed at that time by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. However, he resigned his post shortly after the military coup in Egypt in 2013. Abdullah Bin Bayyah is the founder of several initiatives, including Muslim Council of Elders and Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Society, which both are funded by the UAE. Recently, Abdullah Bin Bayyah was appointed as the chair of the newly established UAE Fatwa Council. As a background of Bin Bayyah's latest view, it's important to know that most of his ideas, political ideas, are associated with the Arab Revolution and post-Arab Spring world. Bin Bayyah's alliance and relation with UAE also reflects many of his political positions and views regarding regional democracy. In an attempt why it's before I mention this, why it's very connected to the post-Arab Abdullah Bin Bayyah's position is very connected to post-Arab idea or post-Arab Spring is because after the Arab Spring, the UAE has attempted to counter the change occurring in the region and hinder the ongoing call for democracy as it's reported and researchers have concluded. It appears that the UAE believe that such transformation would challenge the country's status quo and possibly stimulate the reformists to oppose its rigid policies. Therefore, the UAE has promoted political actors and Muslim scholars to prevent such transformation from occurring. In an attempt to theorizing his political and philosophical foundation of his discourse, Abdullah Bin Bayyah initially attempted to explain the challenges and the reality of Muslims today in his book تنبيه المراجع على تأصيل فقه الواقع. Abdullah Bin Bayyah is very concerned and occupied with the idea of واقع, and not only واقع, he is actually interested in the idea of التوقع, the expected reality, the reality and the expected reality. According to Abdullah Bin Bayyah, the condition of Muslim Ummah in the current era is characterized by two extremes. The first is a modernist subjective call that seeks an imitated product, which is here he meant democracy and Western value, and adopt very flexible rational approach where the ends justifies the mean. The second extreme is the traditional and religious code that ignores the modern contextual reality and does not allow any modern interpretation and implementation of Islamic law that would resolve the challenges encountered in the Muslim era. However, Abdullah Bin Bayyah's view to democracy and political opposition is a negative one-sided view. According to Abdullah Bin Bayyah, the Arab Revolution were motivated by Western values that contradict Islamic principles. He opines that Muslim modernization and reformers have confused the values of Western democracy with those of Islamic ones. Bin Bayyah argues that the Western values of democracy are based on, according to him, on the Hegelian model, which promotes the idea of destruction for reconstruction. Based on Bin Bayyah's assumption, he concludes that the Western model of democracy opposes the Islamic principles of maslaha, or promoting public benefits and preventing harm. At the same time, in his book Tanbih al-Maraja, he also criticized the call for reviving the Islamic tradition, and he asserts that such recreation endeavors are impractical effort to revive what he calls an imagined past. So it's critical to understand these 2 points before understanding how did Abdullah Bin Bayyah use the Maqāṣid discourse to justify all of these thoughts. According to Abdullah Bin Bayyah, he defines maqasid as the spirit of Sharia that is derived from the fundamental resources of the lawgiver, as well as those attained by ijtihad or intellectual reasoning. However, in contrast to the modernist reformer, Abdullah Bin Bayyah, as the speakers before me have mentioned, Abdullah Bin Bayyah believed that usul al-fiqh and maqasid are interconnected and cannot be separated. So he is actually inclined to support traditional jurists like al-Ghazali and al-Shatibi, who suggest that discipline of Sharia but is not independent of it. In order to theorize his thought, Abdullah Bin Bayyah constructs his idea in supporting autocracy on two main ideas. The first one is the prioritization of maqasid al-Sharia. As we mentioned earlier, the modern approach of maqasid, or the reformers and modernists, suggests that or focus on introducing new objectives and new priorities and prioritizing between them new objectives that that Sharia recognizes and aims to achieve at various levels. Abdullah Bin Bayyah's proposal is constructed on this idea of prioritizing the maqasid and introducing new maqasid. He argues that the maqsid, or the objective of peace, is more important and higher in rank than the maqsid of justice. In one of his statements during a speech, at the opening speech of the Forum of Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies that was in Abu Dhabi, Abdullah Bin Bayyah stated that the value of peace has priority over the value of rights. This statement illustrates that despite Bin Bayyah's traditional understanding of the theory that we mentioned, he follows al-Shatibi, the theory of maqasid, he actually does not reject the modernist rationale for introducing new objectives. Rather, he modifies and repurposes and reshapes their approach. So we can see here that he acknowledges the maslaha of preserving human rights, the maslaha of preserving justice, but he also contends that this maslaha contradicts the importance of maintaining peace and social stability. So therefore, he now argues that central values like human rights, justice, and freedom need to be sacrificed in order to establish peace, and there should be a prevalence of the maslaha of preventing revolution and any opposition against established ruler. In other declaration, Abdullah Bin Bayyah, applying the concept of maslaha, Abdullah Bin Bayyah argues that the Muslim society in the Middle East are not yet ready for a democracy, and that any call for democracy in such situation is actually a call for war. His assertions here serves as a reminder of the false dilemma that we all heard, me or chaos, ana aw al-fawda, echoed by many authoritarian rulers in the region, beginning from Mubarak in Egypt, al-Assad in Syria, Zain al-Abidin, all of them actually. The problem is, the use of maslaha here by Bin Bayyah to maintain authoritarianism may not only result in graving injustice and inequalities, rather it also shows that he perceived the Muslim nations to be under a legal emergency status. However, he made no suggestion about when it will be possible to restore the state of normality. When will the Ummah go back to a normal state where they can claim justice or rights. Abdullah bin Bayyah here used the vocabulary of avoiding war in his statements, in his book, Tanbih al-Maraja, and remaining in obedience, which also inherited from the historical rhetoric of Dawlat al-Khilafa and Dawla al-Sultaniyya. And in fact, it's interesting to mention here that the traditional Salafist discourse, a strand of them, not all of them, a strand of the quietist Salafist or Salafist discourse used this exact period as a constant reference against revolutions and against opposition of the ruler. However, Abdullah bin Bayyah reintroduces such discourse in a new modern approach, namely Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. Despite his claim to the contrary, Abdullah bin Bayyah does not offer another political approach for the modern political system that he rejects. Rather, he promotes the long-held principle of classical fiqh, which states that rebellion against the ruler should be prohibited and that there should be no opposition against the ruler, or la khuruj ala al-hakim. Once again, this kind of principle was what perceived as the highest Islamic principle in fiqh al-siyasat al-Sharīʿa by the Salafist and the traditionalists in the region, who determines citizen-ruler relationship based on the literal interpretation of scriptural resources, or hadith ta'at wali al-amr and hadith al-bay'ah, and so on. On the other hand, when we look to the modernist approach to maqāṣid, we will find that their scholars distinguish between the passive rebellion and the armed insurrection. They argue that the legitimacy of rebellion is profoundly linked to the motivation behind him, to the legality of the ruler, to whether they are just or not. All of these contributes to the legality of the opposition. So not every khuruj is prohibited. Nonetheless, Abdullah bin Bayyah interpretation of maslaha expands the prohibition of the opposition to include all kinds of revolutions and rebellions. So it can be argued that the use of maqāṣid approach here by Abdullah bin Bayyah alters actually, or shifts the rulership in the modernist theory, transforming it from a conditional legal relationship that could be ended or revoked to a paternal relationship that is natural and unchangeable. It also shifts the theory's emphasis on the priority of justice, rights, democracy, and giving priority to and legal backing to preventing opposition and maintaining authoritarianism. Although Abdullah bin Bayyah's view seems to be that peace can be only attained through authoritarianism, it's important also and it's fair to note that his previous interviews before the Arab Spring and books that were published before the Arab Spring suggest the exact opposite. For instance, in his book, Culture of Terrorism, Abdullah bin Bayyah regards justice and good advisory governance as significant approach of seeking solution for political conflict, and he suggests that justice can be attained through justice. However, most of these views on the importance of justice have changed after he became allies with the UAE. The second idea that Abdullah bin Bayyah constructs his thought on is the idea of tahqiq al-manat, which is a very important concept in the field or the realm of usul al-fiqh. Following the announcement of peace deal between the UAE and Israel, Abdullah bin Bayyah, in his as a president of the Emirati Fatwa Council, affirms that the international relations and treaties are amongst the actions that fall within the policy-making specialization of the ruler. Although this declaration appears to be related to pre-modern discourse or the Salafist discourse, whereby only a ruler have the power to make treaties and with foreign powers and formulate policy, public policy, the declaration, however, again adopts the modern approach of maqāṣid. How is this connected to tahqiq al-manat? Abdullah bin Bayyah's understanding of tahqiq al-manat, or definition, he has his own definition also of tahqiq al-manat that is based on the concept of reality, as we mentioned, that he is occupied with the understanding of the reality. He defines tahqiq al-manat as a deep diagnosis of the reality or of the waqi', to understand the legal cause behind the verdict and subsequently apply it to the current context. So he suggests that there are three major elements and problems in the waqi' or the reality of Muslim today. Number one, the failure of identifying the reality, or the failure of identifying the impact of the reality on the verdicts or the ruling, and the failure of recognizing the proper methodology to deal with such reality. In his book, Tanbih al-Maraja, again, Abdullah bin Bayyah raises the question of who has the authority of tahqiq al-manat, of verifying the legal cause or the reality? To answer this question, Abdullah Bin Bayyah attempts to reinterpret the concept of ijtihad, or what's known as independent reasoning, human reasoning in Islamic law or Sharia law. So he reinterpret the concept of ijtihad by classifying it into three groups. The first is ijtihad in issues concerning individual, whereby they are left to them to decide whether how to practice their faith based on the layperson or individual's verification of their own reality. He illustrates with the example of an ill individual who determines whether they are too sick to fast during the month of Ramadan or not by themselves. You don't need a jurist or a judge or a scholar for this. A second type of ijtihad, according to Abdullah Bin Bayyah, is regarding newly emerging issues such as financial transactions, which are supposed to be referred to specialized committees. And the third ijtihad related to duties of what he calls a Sultan al-Akbar. He actually calls it like this, a Sultan al-Akbar, the grand ruler. These include the declaration of war, peace treaties, and governance, which should all be left exclusively to the ruler. Accordingly, it seems that Abdullah Bin Bayyah advancing an anti-jurist approach. We don't need a jurist anymore if the individual will judge for themselves and newly emerged issues will be referred to a specialized committee. Similarly, jurists should not be consulted in any legal or constitution where during the ruler's decision making. This is because, according to Abdullah Bin Bayyah, jurists do not understand the full reality or the implication of certain decisions, nor do they know the ruler's hidden motivation, which could be difficult for them to understand. Now, there are many problems with this Abdullah Bin Bayyah's discourse. That although that he addresses the questions of why we need to identify the reality and who had the authority to identify the reality in his book تنبيه المراجع على تأطير فقه الواقع. One of the limitations of his explanation is that it does not address the question of how the reality should be dealt with. On the other hand, in one of his fatwa that is published on his website, and also it is in the book of علاقة أصول الفقه بالمقاصد, Abdullah Bin Bayyah acknowledged that there are one of the major methodological defects that have resulted in significant crisis in the Muslim world is the use of text without paying attention to the spirit of maqasid and the maqasid. He further argued that such methodological defect occurs in three different stages: the stage of ta'wil, textual interpretation, which deals with the text, with addresses the question of what is the verdict, and the stage of ta'lil, rational reasoning, which addresses the question of why based on the maqasid sharia, and the stage of tanzil, the application, which answers the question of how should the verdict be applied based on the contextual realities. Interestingly, Abdullah Bin Bayyah suggests that the ruler has all-inclusive authority with regard to policymaking and taking decision on political relations. However, once again, he does not attempt to identify the qualities of such ruler, which qualify him or them to deal solely with the three stages of ijtihad, ta'wil, ta'lil, and tanzil, nor does he address their legal duties or the process of their appointment. So Abdullah Bin Bayyah's approach, therefore, has failed to verify the legal cause or identify the reality. Another problem is that despite the fact that Abdullah Bin Bayyah's lectures and books highlight the importance of fiqh al-waqi' or fiqh of reality, his argument actually overlooked a lot of the dramatic transformation and changes that have occurred to the political structure that transformed it from a sultanic state to the modern nation state, and from an individual's rule to the rule of institutions. Another problem is that the modern maqasid-oriented approach was mainly developed by Islamic reformer and modernists who introduced new branches of fiqh, like fiqh al-aqliyat, fiqh of minorities, fiqh al-waqi', fiqh of realities, fiqh al-ma'alat, fiqh of results and consequences. They employ the modern nation state and its requirement at the basis of modern law. They argue that the state's legality is determined by the will of the nation, including its jurists, and not by the ruler solely. However, Abdullah Bin Bayyah now uses the very same methodology and means for the opposite purpose. To conclude, why maqasid? Even though Abdullah Bin Bayyah adopts the modernist model of maqasid and certain elements of maslaha discourse, his elaboration reflects many of the, as we mentioned, quite Salafist thoughts, one may pose the question regarding why Bin Bayyah decided to use the modern approach of Maqāṣid to present his traditional thought that support authoritarianism, if the result of his assertions, like those of the quiet Salafists who promote strict obedience to Muslim rulers and silence of political matters, then there is a question of why Bin Bayyah did not simply justify his thought using the traditional doctrine and the long list of texts that we have on Hadith, again, the Hadith of the Ta'at Wali al-Amr or al-Bay'ah or the absolute obedience, and all of these, why he decided to use such discourse. Indeed, it could be difficult to understand these traditional political viewpoints by a jurist who proposed the understanding of the reality and the modern context. However, we could conclude that regardless of the quiet Salafist unconditional support to the ruler and their opposition of any type of rebellion, they appear to have become more defensive and marginalized after the uprising at the Arab Spring. A likely explanation is that their doctrine is possibly rigid and incapable of adapting the notion of religious moderation, which the UAE is trying to sell to the West. However, the most appropriate approach for the UAE or narrative for the UAE is the Salafist traditional narrative, which guarantee absolute obedience and prevent rebellion. While UAE takes or Abdullah Bin Bayyah takes the very same approach and reshaping it in the modern framework of the Maqāṣid-oriented approach, which promotes the UAE's image and credibility in the international relations. To conclude, just final thought, with the ever-increasing number of the Maqāṣid and the constantly changing priorities and the absence of the appropriate guidelines, one may argue that the Maqāṣid-oriented approach has become an ambiguous feature. This paper argues actually that the ideological utilization of the Maqāṣid discourse can shift the theory's objectives from its purpose-oriented basis to result-oriented and utilitarian reasoning. This may result in its misapplication or misuse or abuse by different ideologies and agendas to achieve different outcomes. And indeed, Abdullah Bin Bayyah's subjective interpretation and prioritization of Maqāṣid-oriented approach to satisfy utilitarian objectives could result in the failure to effectively reform the legal theory. And yeah, that's it. I'm sure I took more of the time that was dedicated for me. Thank you so much.